Good afternoon, this is Media Center, Ukraine, Odesa. We continue our work today, and our next speaker is Vira Yastrebova, Attorney Director of the NGO Східна правозахисна група. Vira will update us about the situation with the violation of human rights in the occupied territories of Ukraine. The floor is yours. Good afternoon. I would like to thank organizers and also those who have joined us today online. And today I would like to inform you about the situation in the temporarily occupied territories, the measures taken by the occupier, and what is the result of the activities of the so-called law enforcement bodies in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. As for new measures by the so-called law enforcement bodies of the occupier, this is the creation of the network of whistleblowers who report about the local population who is not law-abiding, those people who criticize the occupation authorities, the Kremlin, Putin, and those who are not afraid about expressing their opinion despite being in occupation. And we know about the repression machine who tried to counteract occupiers, and we know about the examples in the Kherson Oblast at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. But now the occupation authorities are afraid of those people who express their opinion when talking to their neighbors or standing in a queue near shops. The people, after denunciations, are interrogated, and quite often this implies negative consequences for people who are not afraid to express their views. Now we have examples of bringing to criminal liabilities to those illegal quasi-courts and to the so-called law enforcement bodies in the temporarily occupied territories. For example, in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia Oblast, the political policy of occupiers of the Russian court detained 42 local residents suspected of collaborating with the Ukrainian special services. We also know about a terrible case of detention of a 19-year-old resident of Mironenko that removed the occupation flag, and now the criminal case was initiated against that girl under Article 329 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation. We know about 83 people who were detained. This is the information that we were able to verify. But we understand that, unfortunately, the number of such cases is increasing. And such strict control over thinking, over what people say, and these accusations, unfortunately, the situation will deteriorate. There is a well-developed FSB network in the occupied territories of Kherson Oblast, and they detained 54-year-old citizens of Ukraine for taking part in the public campaign Crimean blockade back in 2016. So we know that those FSB officers and their proxies that try to identify so-called protesting electorate, and they use their favorite means to deal with such people like illegal accusation, repression, and tortures, and I will share more details a bit later. As for the situation in the Donetsk region, we have also learned about the detention of 3 citizens of Ukraine who 10 years ago, in 2012-2013, served in the armed forces of Ukraine. And unfortunately, they were detained because of denunciations. Also, in the temporarily occupied territories of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, FSP and occupation police officers conducted a raid to identify the places of storage of Ukrainian manuals and textbooks. In total, during the reporting period, more than 5,000 Ukrainian books have been destroyed. And also, even Ukrainian books are perceived by the occupants that they could not trust that person, as they say. In the temporarily occupied territory of the Zaporizhia Oblast, there were also detentions, like the case of a 42-year-old citizen of Ukraine who has been detained for alleged collecting of information for the benefit of Ukraine. There is one more body which is now represented in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, namely Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation. Thus, in the occupied Zaporizhia region, a criminal case was opened for recruitment to commit terrorist acts. The investigative committee believes that the suspect, who is a 34-year-old resident of Berdansk, who previously served in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine as a senior soldier of the firing range of the 56th Separate Motorized Infantry Brigade. According to the occupiers, he decided to carry out a terrorist attack. The person was detained and no protection is allowed. There are occupants courts who work there and who will investigate such cases. As for the Kherson region, in the first 6 months of 2023, the investigative committee of the Russian Federation in the occupied Kherson region detained people in 190 criminal cases against citizens. So they initiated 190 criminal cases against 234 persons. This is only during 6 months of 2023. And 45 criminal cases were sent to illegal occupation courts. We understand that, unfortunately, people are accused of serious and especially serious crimes. 37 people have been already accused, and we understand that the proceedings are very quick there. And we understand that the sentences that they could face. So these people don't have hope to be released from the prison. There is only one precondition for this: the liberation of the occupied territories of Ukraine, because sometimes there are even life sentences. The head of that occupation body, the investigative committee, by striking, held a meeting in occupied Mariupol, where he said that the units of his investigative committee initiated 38 820 cases as of the end of July, and we now can understand the pace of their activities. And I'd like to say that the investigative committee of the Russian Federation never stops the case after initiation. So we should expect that our Ukrainians will be sentenced in the long run. And there is the question, why the Russian Federation takes such actions? This is an attempt to control the local population and intimidating people, and the creation of favorable conditions for illegal elections that are planned for the beginning of September this year. The Russian Federation could also use only violence and terror when it comes to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. People suffer not only the very low social and economic conditions of life, but also the constant potential threat to be sentenced, to be sent to prison. People could get to the basements of FSB units who are there. As for the general situation in the temporarily occupied territories and those who are involved in this pressure on the local population, namely the military police of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. So they detain people who are reluctant to sign contracts to be sent to the armed forces of the Russian Federation. These so-called law enforcement officers control all internal checkpoints. That's why it is very difficult for locals to move around the territory. And it is also difficult to move from one city to another city for men who have no confirmation of their collaboration with the occupants, and for the Russian Federation, those people who are considered loyal, that collaborate as a part of the law enforcement bodies, the Russian Guard, or some other law enforcement bodies. As for the general situation in the temporarily occupied territories of the Lugansk region, the situation is very difficult, and we understand that the situation there is different from the territories that were actually occupied in 2014 and the territories that have been occupied at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation. We know about cases of people sentenced to the so-called state treason of Ukrainian citizens and also a Russian citizen who lived in the village of Lutuhina of the Luhansk region. Citizens of Ukraine who was captured as a military serviceman under a contract in the military unit of the National Guard of Ukraine. He was sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment in a high-security prison. This means that the Russian Federation ignores all international norms and rules and immunity of prisoners of war. And they sent to prison Ukrainian servicemen under falsified accusation, and thus they keep our people in prisons there. One more case when a serviceman of the armed forces of Ukraine was captured and he was sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment. These are just several examples that allow us to realize the situation in the temporarily occupied territories. As for the situation in the temporarily occupied territory of Donetsk region, the situation is also bad there. A serviceman was sentenced to 25 years of imprisonment after he was captured. The military of the National Guard of Ukraine, who was captured by the occupiers, was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment. One more soldier from Ukraine who was captured was sentenced to 17 years of imprisonment. I use this word sentenced, but we understand that this is not a real sentence. This is like we cannot speak about real court proceedings, but this person is sent to prison, and we should just understand how long occupiers are ready to keep these people in prisons. There is one more case in the Donetsk region where the Ukrainian National Guard officer was got life sentence. They have a so-called law managing the activities of these quasi-courts, and unfortunately, this law envisages not only life sentence, but also the death penalty. These are the instructions of torturers that they use. I cannot call them codes or laws, and we cannot ignore the fact that this is what is happening in our temporarily occupied territories. And we cannot provide any practical assistance to such people because we have no access, physical access to those territories. So we should renew our control there to free those people, to provide them any help, to give them some status, and just to save them. As for forced deportation of children, and we have provided information on numerous occasions about the deportation situation in general. And here I would share with you the following information. As of the 1st of August 2023, the occupation authorities is planning to take 50,000 children to the Russian Federation, and they have already taken from those territories 30,000 people. The Russian Federation has changed the tactics to deport children. They just take them to the Russian Federation under the guise of rehabilitation. They use more groups of children with less participants, as they used to do before Putin and Lvova-Belova received the order of the criminal court for deportation of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation. So at the moment, we understand that we should not expect children to return from the so-called rehabilitation. This is an attempt of the Kremlin authorities to guise their crime under the pretext of rehabilitation. This is just the new format of deportation. And there is one more possibility for deportation that already is there in the occupied territories of the Luhansk Oblast. This is the data bank for orphans. The first parents come from the Russian Federation before selecting children in a catalog, and then they come to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to take children to the territory of the Russian Federation. It will be very difficult to identify the whereabouts of such children. We understand that they change personal data of the children, their names and other data, and it is very difficult to identify their whereabouts, let alone to ensure return of these children to Ukraine. Thus, the Russian Federation tries to make this process as difficult as possible. And also, we know the situation within the imprisoned. There we know how they use such people in the so-called private military companies, and they just use them to fight against Ukraine. It is also known now that the Kremlin is working on a legislative mechanism that will give the administration of the scene of the Russian Federation penitentiary services of the Russian Federation to transfer prisoners to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And what is the reason for this? First of all, we know about the so-called tourism of workers, teachers who get increased salary and get the status of the persons involved in hostilities. And they came to Ukraine. But now they understand that the occupation is closer over there every day, and it is very different. It is unsafe for the people to stay there. Those people who came from the Russian Federation to work on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. That's why they decide to involve in hard labor prisoners. So Putin creates his gulags. Prisoners from the Russian Federation are brought to the occupied territories of Ukraine. At least this is what they plan to do. To use their labor free of charge or for small salaries, and to involve them in hard labor, in physical work. Because now it is very difficult to hire Russians, even if they are offered doubled salary. Forced prospering is ongoing. But the base planned by the Kremlin could not be met because of several reasons, including ignorance or avoidance of people to meet with law enforcement officers. We should also say that when it comes to healthcare services, educational services, bank services, everything is now impossible without presenting the ID of the Russian Federation. But despite the fact in this quasi-political process with regard to the so-called election, there were statements that people could participate in election even using Ukrainian IDs, even using a driving license, because the Russian Federation wants to show in the media the amount of people involved in election to legitimize this occupation policy of Putin through the political process. As for passportization in the occupied territories, it is ongoing. Occupant authorities continue putting pressure on people for them to get those passports, and the additional means that they use it that now law enforcement officers can detain people for 30 days without an explanation or protocol for if they refuse to get a Russian passport. During first 2 weeks of August in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, in the temporarily occupied territories, there are 138 people detained in the Luhansk region and 103 people in the Donetsk region. So people will be kept imprisoned for 30 days for their refusal to get Russian passports. And to summarize, I would like to say that we got new information, and I was astonished because I know the place where we had the office of our organization. This is the city of Lysychansk in Luhansk Oblast. We got in contact with the locals staying there in occupation, and we were informed that near the hospital in Titova Street, where the city morgue is located in the basement, occupation authorities created a prison, a torture room for local residents who are suspected in cooperating with Ukraine. We understand that actually those who try to control those territories and the occupation regime will not be stopped by anything. So they are cruel, they disrespect any principles of the common sense and moral. And those who are there now in the temporarily occupied territories are in potential danger. They could be detained, they can be illegally imprisoned. Under false denunciation, these people can be sent in a basement torture room. And this is also means the situation when people barely survive in those unhuman conditions because they cannot get jobs. This is a short digest with regard to changes over the first 2 weeks of August. And if you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sasha Borrego from United States Medias. I have two questions for you. I listen your informed, but you don't talking about some points I consider very, very important. The first one is the situation of the child abuse in the occupied places. And the second is about the Astobal remains holder in the occupation places too. So I will doing concrete questions, and I'm expecting as much as possible in your opinion as attorney to tell me where is the situation. The first one is, what can you do about the sex trafficking of teenagers in occupied places, and how Ukraine government and your NGO to prevent that? My second question is, what can you do, tell us, about the Astobal soldiers who no have yet been released and staying remain in jail in occupied areas and zones? Thank you so much.
As for the first question, how we can fight the situation with the child abuse and the sexual tourism of teenagers. Am I right in understanding of your question? Could you just repeat the question? Because a lot has been said, but to be more precise.
I want to know, what can you tell us about the sex? So my question is, what can you tell us about the sex trafficking of teenagers in occupied places and what do you do to prevent it? So, I mean, I will more
Ну, давайте на
specifically.
перше питання відповідь, да?
I can answer the first question first. What to do with this sex trafficking of teenagers in the temporarily occupied territories. I can say that to effectively stop this crime that you mentioned is that we need to restore Ukrainian control over the temporarily occupied territories. As the member of my organization that I am representing today, and I actually was born in the Donetsk region, in the city which is now occupied, and I am well aware of the situation there. And I'm sure that we can try to make the Russian Federation stop occupation, and only after that, only we will be able to ensure the effective parliamentary control when it comes to respecting human rights and the work of law enforcement bodies who will investigate the facts of violations that are there in the temporarily occupied territories now. When it comes generally about crimes, we cannot stop them. We could have effective pre-court investigation and the real bringing to liability of people involved in these crimes. But unfortunately, when occupying Ukrainian territory, the Russian Federation does not respect any human rights or the international law, because otherwise the Russian Federation would have never occupied Ukraine first in 2014, and under the guise of the quasi-republic created by the Russian Federation as the pretext for the beginning of the occupation, and would have never started the full-scale bloody war later. We can be sure that we can prevent or stop these crimes only when the responsible persons will be brought to real responsibility, and other persons who will think about someone's sexual freedom or someone's territory will be stopped by understanding that the punishment will be there. And the second question?
Yes, but I need to clarification in this first one because I don't understood the last one. So basically, at the moment, you cannot do nothing to avoid anything in the territory about the sex trafficking. It happened now there. That is, you cannot do nothing. Your NGO. What happened with the Red Cross or with the UNICEF or another organization who have contact with the Russian or wherever government is been there at the moment? So is any can be do it from Ukraine for save those children at the moment?
Ну,
I've told about deportation of children. Now you're asking about children, teenagers that suffering other crimes, namely sexual trafficking, sexual exploitation. And as our organization, so we can just follow the standards and the laws of Ukraine, and we need first to confirm that cases. So we collect information about such cases, and those having signs of crime are submitted to the General Prosecutor's Office and the Security Service of Ukraine, if this is their area of responsibility, and the National Police of Ukraine. You, as a journalist, and if you also believe that you have some facts proving these crimes that could help to identify criminals and to bring them to criminal liability, can also share this information with the Ukrainian law enforcement bodies who work on these cases. As for the next question, please.
My second question is. Yes. Second question is, what can you tell us about the Astobal soldiers who have not been yet releasing and remaining in jail in occupied area zones?
Unfortunately, you should address not me, but those who are keeping their soldiers imprisoned. And they are kept there by the Kremlin, who started this war. I can tell you that only the support of Ukraine at diplomatic level, as well as with the liberation of Ukrainian territories, will make it possible to liberate our soldiers who protected or defended our country. And how to expedite the process, we should work at our own front. We should consolidate our efforts. We should remember about who is our enemy, and we should fight against this problem. I believe that the Ukrainian government, including the Ukrainian ombudsman and other people who are involved in preparing and lobbying the release process, they do everything possible. I work as the attorney, and in 2014 I learned myself what the occupation is, how it is to have the Russian army in your home city. That's why I do what I can now. If I could, I would have done everything possible to release those people. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you very much for your report. And we will wait for updated information about the violation of human rights in the occupied territories. Our next briefing will be at 2 p.m., and that will be dedication to winemaking in the Odesa region, so stay tuned.